And another huge thank you to Mojo for sponsoring the event. The photo exhibit for this event is outside the library and the Learning Center, and it'll be there at the end of April. If you need help finding it, you can speak to me or our fantastic librarian, Lieutenant and Sarah Fry. All right, so voter suppression has always occurred in American politics, but the form it takes is constantly changing. When Jim traveled south from New York in 1965 to fight voting suppression, he was acting against a powerful form of injustice in our system. In fact, that same injustice is still being implemented today, hidden in the massive streams of information we observe in our day-to-day lives. And all this force needs to do to win is to convince you not to participate in our democratic process. So I'd like you to just keep that in the back of your heads if you listen to Jim today. And yeah, again, thank you all for coming. And without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Mr. Jim Lemkin.
Wow, this is a great audience. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it. Can you hear? Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Get in that row. Okay. Well, I never thought I would actually be doing this. 2 years ago, if you were to tell me that I would be standing up and talking about voter suppression, I wouldn't know what you were talking about, because actually I'm a holistic doctor and a filmmaker and a photographer, and it wasn't until about a year after the election of the president in 2016, a year of complaining and whining and depression and despair and any number of emotions, most of which were negative and didn't go anywhere. And then one day I was down in my basement and I had an old trunk, and I was looking through the trunk for something else, and I found an envelope with photographs that said Mississippi 1965. And I went, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't looked at them in 50 years. And I thought, why don't I restore them and see what was there? And as I was restoring them, I began to realize that the story of voter suppression before the Civil Rights Act, I'm sorry, before the Civil Rights Act, but before the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which was deeply suppressive of people of color, and specifically African Americans, and especially in the South. And the reason for the Voting Rights Act was to restrict thoroughly discriminatory laws that prohibited most African Americans from voting in some of these states. For example, in Mississippi, where I ultimately wound up, only 6% of African Americans were able to vote. And 2 years after the Voting Rights Act, 60% were able to vote, and you can be sure they did. So, so I looked at these photographs and I realized that what was happening before the Voting Rights Act pretty much stopped. Because in essence, the Voting Rights Act was a federal piece of legislation, and it said you can't discriminate, well, very briefly, you can't discriminate in voting. And there was a bunch of shenanigans that were going on, like, well, I don't want to get too much into it because we have so much to do, but for example, they had something called the literacy test. And so an African American would go in to register to vote, and it was all up to the states. All these laws that are discriminatory are state laws, not federal laws, almost entirely. So when we're really looking at a state law. So, and it was up to the local registrar. So an African American would go in and say, I want to vote, and he would be handed some detailed, obscure passage from the Constitution, and he says, here, read this and interpret it. A white person would come in and I could read it, but I would hardly be able to interpret it when I went to college. A white person would come in and the registrar would say, read the headline of the newspaper, and that would be all that was necessary. So it was unfair in every possible way. There's any number of things like hangings, intimidation, burning, torching people's homes, all kinds of things that prohibited or basically scared away African Americans from voting in the South. So the Voting Rights Act did away with all of that, and it basically said if any state wants to pass any kind of voting laws, you have to clear them with the Department of Justice at the federal level, not the state level. And there were over 1,000, way over 1,000 challenges between 1965 and 2013 when a key provision of the Voting Rights Act was repealed, and it basically did away with the U.S. government oversight of the states creating new laws. And the laws that came after that were almost entirely directed at people of color, the poor, the elderly, the disadvantaged, and students. And there's been 2 hours after the Supreme Court decision to overturn a key provision in 2013, states began to create new laws to suppress votes. And it goes on today. And so the first part of what I want to do is tell you a story about what I was doing in Mississippi. And then the second part will be about what the games are that are being played now. And to be honest, my real intention of doing this was to, first of all, correct my own mind and heart from a place of negativity and reaction to an opportunity for me to share and spread the word that you all, every single last one, can make a difference in what this country looks like. I know you've heard this before, but it's really true. Your voice is your vote is your voice. There are other ways to express your voice, but voting is one of the most powerful. And by the way, in the present midterm elections just a few months ago, it's largely because of young people who are notoriously unregistered and unvoting, but enough of them came out that it was able to tilt the balance in favor of people who are concerned, in my opinion, only more with justice and equality and fairness. And so the reason I'm doing all this is because I'm not a Democrat or Republican. I really will never be, probably. But I care a lot about fairness. And we are a community of human beings. Our planet, right, our society and human beings are really all part of one creation. And if we want health, and we're not getting it, and I tend, as a holistic doctor, I tend to think of everything I do in terms of, is it healing or harming? It's a good practice if you want to just do it, try it anytime you want. Is what I'm about ready to do healing or harming? Myself, others, the world, whatever. So the reason I'm doing this is very long-winded, but is because I've decided to do something constructive, hopefully, and spread the word that there is something that you can do. And at the end, we will talk about what you can do. Can I just take a real quick poll? How many people in the last election in November were eligible to vote? Not so, okay, whoa, all right. How many people were registered to vote? How many people voted? All right, excellent, excellent. I'm impressed, thank you. So, in 1965, I was a sophomore in college, and in the north. And I saw a poster about the Voting Rights Act that had just passed in August, and there was going to be an action, we call it political action, but it really isn't politics. It's let's call it a human action, to go down to Mississippi and help register black voters. Now, I'm clearly a privileged white person. It has not escaped me that we had the opportunity to do that. Not everybody did, and I don't think for a minute what we did was more than one little dot of light, one dot of help in the world. But if you've ever been in a room with a lot of people, and imagine we all had candles and it was completely dark in there, right? And one person lights a candle, there's not a lot of light. But when 150 or 200 people all light candles in a darkened room, it's quite light. And that's really all that I did. I was just one light, and I will repeat over and over again, I encourage you to also be a candle and do what you can and take action, because action actually makes a difference. And it truly made a difference in the last election when young people began to vote a bit more. The deal is, the older you are, the more you are likely to vote Republican. The younger you are, the more likely you are by far to vote Democrat. The older you are, the more likely you are to vote, and the younger you are, the more likely you are to not vote. So I'm thrilled that you guys, most of you guys are totally clued in. So I saw this poster. It was from the National Student Association in conjunction with an organization called SNCC, or Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, CORE, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and some others. And we were, they were having an action during Christmas vacation to come down to, inviting students to come down from 300 schools around the country to Mississippi to just help register voters. So, oh, can we turn the lights off? Okay, well, all the lights, there you go. Okay, so I wrote to SNCC and I said, would you like me to photograph this for you and help out? And they said, yeah, here's 5 other people coming from New York, living in New York, and so we all met. We drove down in that van day and night from let's see, is there a pointer? From basically New York, which is over here. Can people see that a little bit? Yeah. Okay, we drove and we wound up in Mississippi. And where we ultimately went after we did training, and I'll show you that in a minute, was in Mississippi's the poorest state in the country. Walthall County, which is over here, is the very southern part of the state, and it's one of the very poorest counties in the state. So there we are, kind of driving down the country roads. When we got there, you know, I had read about this in history books and stuff, and seen lots of pictures. I didn't realize this was still going on. Separate but equal was outlawed in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act in public accommodations. And yet it was still going on in pretty much early 1966, about 2 years later. They didn't care in the South. They did not like the federal laws one bit. And there was a lot of tension. Now I want to say, I'll be talking about Southerners a little bit. Not all Southerners were segregationists by any means, but there was enough that they controlled the legislatures and the courthouses and all of the places where it matters politically. Except they don't control the streets, which is why the Selma March and other marches like that, as you may have heard of, were so important. It got the attention of the president. So when I say that voting is your voice, absolutely, absolutely, it's a really efficient way to do it. There are many cases in the last election where the candidate won only by a few votes or a few hundred votes. So anyway, I couldn't believe my eyes, but this is actually what's going on 2 years after the Civil Rights Act. So I find this a little ironic, but this is the State House in Jackson, Mississippi, and that's the state flag. Even to this day, Mississippi is the only state that still incorporates the Confederate flag in their state flag. They've tried many times to get rid of it, all kinds of new designs, and they keep getting voted down. Oh, and this is in the State House building, 2 years after it was illegal. When I say they didn't give a damn, I actually meant it. Anyway, I won't get into it. So, we drove for a couple days and we wound up in Jackson, and we had a training at a African American church. This is a way to get rid of the white. Oh, let me try this. And so we all piled into the church, and we had training for a full day. And the training was really important because we were actually at a little bit of risk. A couple of years prior, there had been bus burnings with people who tried to register blacks to vote. We're fighting for the Civil Rights Act. At least a few people got killed, civil rights workers. So we were pretty careful. We had a good training. I could sure use more at some point. So here are a couple people in one of the trainings. Doing role playing. We were told, well, first of all, most of the African American people lived out in the rural areas, and that's where we were confined. We were taught how to defend ourselves in case we got attacked, how to physically protect ourselves, how to be as invisible as possible in the city. The town that we were, the whole county is under 20,000, and the biggest city is Tylertown, which was about 2,000. So we were completely visible, driving a van, which nobody drove with New York plates. So within a day, everybody knew we were there. So we had to learn ways of protecting ourselves, learning how to approach people. I mean, there were local organizers from the African American community, and they were doing wonderful work in helping us. But I don't know who this guy is, but he looks a lot like a lawyer. He said he was probably telling us what our rights were and you know, how to, you know, what we could do legally. Then we broke into groups, we processed, we did more role playing. And then they gave us information for each of any number of counties. We spread out throughout the state of Mississippi, and we were on our own. This is Tylertown downtown. This is the county courthouse. Because it was a federal rule, the Voting Rights Act, the county, I understand, didn't have any obligation to help us in any way. And so all of the voter registration was done at the only federal building in the whole county, which were the post offices. So we did all of our registration in the basement of the post office, and they sent a federal agent to do the registry. All we did was tell people about it and bring them to get registered. We came to town one day to get some food. We pulled into a parking space, and the sheriff of the town came up to us, and he goes, "You old boys better," I'm not trying to make fun of Southern accent, but I mean, I can't do it, but "the old boys can't stay here, you've got to move along now." And I was a little bit of a wise ass, and I said to him, "Yeah, but we put money in the meter." He says, "You old boys better move along now." And so we thought, maybe it was a good idea to move along. It turned out later he was the head of the local KKK. Did most people know what the KKK are? Yeah, good. And it was not, the KKK is not only in Mississippi, by the way, or the South. Martin Luther King spoke at my synagogue a few years earlier, and he was picketed by the Connecticut KKK. So, and there's the Nebraska KKK, and every state pretty much had one. So we didn't get out of our car, and we made ourselves kind of shy in the center of town. Look at that, 26 cents a gallon for gas, that's pretty good. And look at all those antique cars. So this is most likely in town, a white person's home. And this is a sharecropper's home, or was, in the rural areas. So what we did is we just went from country road to country road and stopped wherever we found an African-American house. We had a map that basically outlined where we should be. And we also stopped people just walking down the road. African-American people, it was. And we'd tell them, you know, a lot of them had been notified that we were coming and that it was now legal to vote, and a few of them had registered, but we were there to make sure everybody knew, every house. And I put this slide in because it's kind of a country, windy road. When I was first taken home the first night, we stayed at local African-American homes, and I stayed at the home of Mr. Ball and his grandchildren and his wife. It was the first time I ever slept three in a bed, so that was interesting. And as we were driving home, he pointed to a switch on the dashboard of his old pickup. And he says, "Do you know what this is for?" And I said, "No." And he said, "It's to turn off your taillights." And I said, "Why would you want to turn off your taillights?" He says, "When the Ku Klux Klan is chasing you at night, you turn off your taillights and you disappear down some of these country roads and you lose them." Get the picture? Because sometimes they find you and it's not a good thing. There was intimidation and lots of physical harm that was inflicted for centuries. Occasionally we were followed. And this is the person who then pulled up ahead of us. And I can't remember what he said, but it was something not good because they were laughing, I'm sure. And it was, anyway. But we were never really harassed more than a few times. And it was, one person was in a phone booth calling, and somebody pounded on the phone booth and things like that, but no other physical harm. One of the things we had going for us is that they knew there was a federal presence in the town, the registrar. And once we actually had to call the federal agent to deal with something, actually deal with the sheriff, telling us we couldn't be there. So then we went house to house. I'd like this for that one. And explained what was going on. And generally, we were embraced, although some people were a little bit leery of our intentions, because when a white person goes to an African American's house back then, it didn't always mean a good thing in the end. But we were clearly young, clearly we didn't look like we came from there. And so they listened, and we just explained in detail what they needed to do, and if they needed a ride, we'd help them. Now, there were a lot of houses that didn't have even electricity or water or anything. And yet they were determined to vote. Remember this woman, you'll see her again. She lives in a house with nothing. I mean, the house could kind of blow off the foundation easily, but whatever foundation there is. And yet she was determined to vote. And we had local contact. The woman on the right was a local person who went with us and helped, spread the word with us. So these children, when they grew up, were able to vote. But that's Mr. Ball, who I'm indebted to, and a lovely guy. He had never voted before, and he was determined to vote. We didn't go into anybody's houses because we were told it could be threatening and menacing, so we always stayed on the outside. This is the inside of Mr. Ball's house, and that's Elvis, and that's the bedroom. And that's Mr. Ball, one of Mr. Ball's grandsons. He was checking me out. Really, I mean no harm. And that's another one of his grandsons. That says Colored Cafe on the top. So we also went to any place we could. There's Mr. Ball on the right. We also went to the local black churches. And that's Reverend McGee, and one of us would stand up and explain what we were doing. And this is before the days of the internet, or even for some people telephone, but everybody went to church. And so church was sort of like the internet is now. The word gets out, it's the grapevine. And so that was very helpful. And we were definitely welcome in those churches. And that's Jesse Harris. And he was a Mississippi organizer who came down and helped us for a couple of days. He just passed away. I really wish I had connected with him again after 50 years. He's a wonderful guy, and totally dedicated. He dedicated his whole life to civil rights in Mississippi. Thank you. And so he drove us around a little bit and showed us some things. I put in a couple of kids' photographs because, the actions that we do in this life are often not just for us, it's for the next generation, or as the Native Americans say, for when you do any kind of action, consider how does it affect people 7 generations into the future. Most of the people we saw were very, very poor. They didn't even have enough money for tar paper. And some of them, we had to develop a report. Notice the body language of 4 of the folks there. It's sort of like protective, what are you up to? And I'm sure my presence as a photographer didn't help at all. But once they heard what we were up to, then they got, it was better. And I put this in because, you know, we take so much for granted nowadays. The kids back then in this community had very few, if any, toys. So the toys were the rocks and bowls and whatever you found, logs and trees and forests and stuff. That was their toy. That were the toys. Sometimes I think it's better. We also we're very conscious of not trying to dominate physically over anyone. So we tended to, you know, be lower than they were physically. And to honor them, to honor the struggle as much as we could as privileged white Northerners. I call this the sharecropper's version of Christina's world. Not everybody will get it, but if you know the work of the painter Andrew White. Anyway, bad joke, but. So we worked from the morning until sunset. One-on-one. And not every African American was poor. This guy looked like he was pretty well off. But still, no matter how well off you were, there was no way to pay off the county to get you to vote. It was only through legislation that it was possible. This is from the inside of the van, and when I was restoring, I restored all these photographs. They're much better now. This is SCLC demonstration. It was probably in Jackson or someplace. So that magazine, I noticed that the newspaper headline. So this was a time when there was a lot of activity going on to register voters and to empower people of color. This is the sort of the boundary of where the white folks lived. Well, there's always playing in the hayloft. I like this photograph a lot. You know, once we spent a little time talking with folks, we began to develop a rapport, you know, sort of a connection. So then we would take people and we would stick them in the van and drive them to downtown Tylertown and to the post office. When you know, it didn't matter how poor someone was. They were very interested in being empowered. Why not? So here we are backing up the van. And this gentleman dressed up in his best to get registered. This is something we did that was a big mistake. We were told not to be seen with African Americans. We were actually told not to be seen, but especially not to be seen with African Americans. So this was a mistake. But we did what we had to do. It wasn't that we'd get any retribution. It would be these folks, the locals. So this is the basement of the post office. That's the registrar standing up. And these are just a typical day of people coming in to get registered. So we would help them take the information where they live, all the vital information that they needed to get registered. Remember the woman who I said lived in that house that looked like it might blow away? As soon as she knew she could vote, she was in there. Here's an elderly gentleman and his grandson, I believe. And so what they did is they checked out, the registrar would check out where the person lived, addresses and so forth. And I would love to try to locate that young boy and remembers this, because for the first time in this man's long life, he was finally able to have a voice. So then they took an oath, and they were registered. And there he is, back home, with a new power that he hadn't had. By the way, you can get a roast beef, no, you can get a shrimp dinner for 75 cents. How about a dozen oysters with french fries and a salad for about 50? Or a hamburger for 20 cents. Damn were the days. This is also something we did that was real bad, very bad. We were, three of us, I think after church, decided we were going to have something to eat. We decided to defy the separate but equal ban by lining up the colored line at this segregated ice cream stand. This was just like putting your thumb in the eye of the locals. So it wasn't a good thing to do, but you know, we were 19. You know how it is to be 19. I wanted to show this. This is sort of the last one before we get into the next section about voter rights and stuff. Our goal was to connect with people and to honor the humanness in each of us. You know, there was some connection. This photograph for me means a lot. You know, there's just a mutual regard, mutual humanness that is critical in everything we do in the world of civics and government and human relations and relations with anyone we see, is how do you connect human to human and heart to heart? That's what this movement was, and that's what the movement is now for people who wish to work for voter rights, and it's still an issue. So, and here we are 50 years later. That's three of us. That woman in the last picture is this one. Oh, wait, there's more. A lot more. The other half of this, actually. So back then, Professor Walter, could you give us a 2 or 3 minute view of what it was like before the Voting Rights Act, some of the tiny bit of history of what led up to the Voting Rights Act?
I'll try. I was about 50 years old, 60 years old then. So I'll see if I can fill in some of that.
Exactly.
I think the first thing I want to say is that I want to thank the people who organized this, but I particularly want to thank Jim for being here today. And he hasn't said it or made it clear, but this is, we look back at history, but this is a very scary time in history. I always remind my students, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who entered the civil rights movement in the 1950s, 1954, that he only lived until 1968, so he's only in the movement 14 years, although from his work, it seems like he was there forever. It seems like he's here right now. And people such as Jim, who traveled and worked there, were extremely brave. Although it was popular and people were willing to do it, people lost their lives because of the work that he was involved in. And I think we just really owe him a historical debt, that there were people who showed up for things that need to be showed up for. So Jim, I want to thank you first before I say anything. I'll take just a couple of minutes because we've got so many more slides. Many of us who talk history, we divide history into the modern civil rights movement, which is essentially the period after World War II up until 1968 and 1972, and certainly after African-American soldiers returned from fighting in World War II, and a war that they had been told was to save the world from Nazism, to save the world from democracy, began to make demands. Meaning the thought was, how can you ask us to fight in a war and then to come back? And we don't have the right to vote. We don't have the access to accommodation. We don't have access to school. And that really is a turning point. People mark a point where the civil rights movement began. It's obviously in 1954 when you have the case of Emmett Till and you have the beginning of Rosa Parks. And we can talk about that more in detail. I'm sure that some of that will come up in the time of discussion. By the time we get up to the 1960s, after the foundation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, we began to have SNCC. And the movement began to take on more of a youthful tone. By 1963, we have the March on Washington with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. I do want to say one thing, and it goes on the comments that he made here, that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, he doesn't make the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement makes Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And that's important for us to keep in mind as we talk about how we move forward. In 1963, King gives the March on Washington speech. It's the I Have a Dream speech. And the important thing about that, if you read the speech, and I think as historians, we're taught to kind of go back and read and look and read and look and not just accept it as a document. The story that Martin Luther King is sharing in there is basically he's saying that African Americans had been given a check that had been returned marked insufficient funds. So we remember the piece about the I Have a Dream, but the reality was that Martin Luther King was speaking there because of the nightmare, because of the struggles that the African American community had been in. That was 1963, and Jim has taken us up to 1965. There's a number of urban events, the cry for Black Power, the rise of Malcolm X, all of these are turning points. But this on-the-ground work that people like Jim and the members of SNCC were doing, and so many others, the sit-ins, etc., C.T. Vivian, people like that, that was really essential. Thank you so much.
Okay, hit the lights. Okay, so thank you so much, Professor. So as I mentioned, prior to 1965, the obstacles to voting for people of color was, I mentioned the literacy test. The poll tax was, you had to pay a few dollars. Oh, and if you didn't vote for the last 20 years, you had to pay 20 years worth of a few dollars. And since you probably couldn't pass the literacy test because no one could, except whites, then it didn't even matter what the poll tax was. But the poll tax was a financial disincentive, for sure. We mentioned a little bit about hangings and so forth. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of stuff. The grandfather clause was just, if your grandfather had voted, then you could vote. Well, great. Okay. Now what's going on? Here's the list. It's not a complete list. The list is a lot longer than this. And every one of these things that's listed here, gerrymandering, voter IDs, limits on closing polling stations, limits on early voting, blah, blah, blah. It has a whole bunch of corollaries and sub-chapters and variations on the theme. All of them have variations on the theme. So if it isn't one thing, it's something else. So I'll show you a few of these things. So some of the obstacles, I don't know if can people see that or is it too small? Anyway, you might, there's a whole bunch of interrelated obstacles. And one of the ones that, oh, before I talk about that, here's a quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's a justice in the Supreme Court in the United States right now. May she live long and flourish. In 1965, if you wanted to have, as I mentioned, if you wanted to change any voting rights law, you had to pass it by the U.S. Justice Department. The Voting Rights Act was to protect people so that the new laws wouldn't do what had just been done for the last 100 years or so. Throwing out pre-clearance, and so pre-clearance was if you wanted to change your state law, you had to get it pre-cleared by the Justice Department, the U.S. Justice Department. So when they threw out the key provision of the Voting Rights Act in 2013, she said basically throwing that out is sort of like, to stop discrimination, is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet because you're under the umbrella. Okay? That's the logic that unfortunately got passed. Okay, here's a pizza. The first thing that I want to say, and it's really a major issue in many states, not only in southern states, but, and I want to say again, I'm neither Republican nor Democrat, but it tends to happen more in states that are Republican dominated. And I guess we think that voting in the national election matters, but voting in the state elections don't. Voting in the state elections determines a whole lot about what goes on at the federal level. Because if you have let's say, for our sake, we won't say Democrat and Republican, we will call it peppers and, what is that yellow stuff?
Pineapple.
Pineapple. Whoever puts a pineapple on pizza, but anyway, some people do, I guess. Okay, so it's equal amounts, peppers and pineapples. So, so when the peppers are in charge of the state legislature, then they can set up whatever, since the elimination of the key provision of the Voting Rights Act, they can create pro-pepper districts, right? And the same with the pineapple and the pineapple. So an ideal way to divide up a state so that it's fair is to do an equal representation of both political parties. The moral of the story is whoever controls the pizza cutter controls the legislature of the state, and they then have a big effect on who gets to be the congressional senators and representatives in each state. So you get the picture? Basically, gerrymandering is named after a guy named Governor Jerry from my state of Massachusetts, who was the first guy to figure out how we could draw boundaries that favored one political party over the other. And it looked a little bit like a salamander, and that's why they call it gerrymander. And so in 1964, it was more or less equal representation. Republicans and Democrats had more or less equal. Then they took control in 2000, the Republicans did, and all of a sudden you have 12 Republican representatives in Congress, but only 4 Democrats. Even though the Republican vote was about half still. And so that's what gerrymandering is. Does everybody get it? Everybody understand how important it is the way you carve up a state?
Yeah.
By districts? This is an unusually beautiful carving job. Can you believe it? I mean, some of these connections are like 1 street wide. Talk about manipulating who goes to Congress. This is a great example of an absurd district. And a lot of states do it. My state of Massachusetts is in New York, are heavily gerrymandered in favor of Democrats. So it's not only a Republican thing. So the darker the color, the more gerrymandered it is. Okay. There's something that's been emerging as another form of voter suppression, and it's the claim of voter fraud, that you're voting illegally. It goes on endlessly. In fact, even last week, the Texas legislature, I'm not sure, the Attorney General or somebody in the state found 100,000 people who were legal immigrants voting in the past election. And so they took them off were eligible, or it looked like they could vote, and they took them off the voting rolls because they were immigrants. But the data they were using, this is almost 100,000, 95,000 people. The data they were using was 25 years old, and most of them had become citizens. And yet the data that they used was an excuse to get basically immigrants, people of color, the disadvantaged poor. I'm going to say it numerous times, but the people who are more likely to vote with a more open-hearted, egalitarian view of the world are suppressed and marginalized. And in even Texas, that has happened as of last week. So this is going on in various states all the time. One of the biggest ways that some people claim there's voter fraud is through misrepresenting yourself when you go to the polls. And that's why all these voter ID laws, how many people have heard of the voter ID laws? Okay, good. So it means when you go to the poll, you have to show some ID. Well, there's all kinds of games that are played. All of this is gameplay. Doing whatever is people who don't want to have people of color, elderly, disadvantaged, and poor students to vote. So somebody did an analysis of 1.3 billion votes in America in the last 10 or 15 years, and they found about 200 or 300 cases out of 1 billion of voter fraud. And yet some states justify voter ID laws and strict ones with all kinds of games for voter fraud when it almost doesn't exist at all. It virtually almost doesn't exist and hasn't existed. Now here's another, these are actual numbers. They're registered voters, but they don't have a photo ID. Why wouldn't somebody have a photo ID? Well, different states have different things. Sometimes, you were born at home and you don't have any birth certificate. Sometimes you changed your address. No, that's something else. Why wouldn't you have a voter ID? I mean, a photo ID. You don't drive. There are a lot of people who are poor and disadvantaged who don't drive. And they have never gone to the DMV or whatever they call it here, DMV, Department of Motor Vehicles, to get a license to drive. So nowadays, some states are having voter IDs issued at DMVs or voter registration at DMVs. Some states do, and some states don't. But and sometimes some states make it very difficult to get a legitimate photo ID. It's very difficult. When people are working, 9 to 5 or whatever, and the polls are not open, not the polls, the registration offices are not open, or are open but they can't get to it, they are eliminated as potential voters. So the number of actual cases of voter fraud in the last 2 elections was 4, and yet the number of people who were excluded in Texas because they didn't have a valid photo ID for whatever reason was over 600,000. You get the picture? So this is pretty self-explanatory. This is across the United States. 25% of blacks don't have a valid photo ID. 18 to 24-year-olds don't. Seniors. Oh, but a lot more whites do. They have valid IDs. And so this is just another way of saying the same thing. The people who are excluded are the people who are least able to get a voter ID for whatever reason. And voter ID, I'll zoom through that. Okay. I don't know if I have time for this, but I'll do it anyway. There's a very insidious technique of eliminating people, and that is your name, you have a hyphenated name, you don't put the hyphen in, you're out. Because the hyphen matters. Or if you said Jim Jones instead of James Jones, you're out. Or if you say you live on 223 Center Street and you live at 335 or you moved or whatever, you're out. And you are issued a provisional ballot in some states, which means then you have to go and prove in a timely manner. Some people say a week, some people say longer. You have to prove that you are who you say you are, right? And so I'm glad to say that Massachusetts is not part of that. When they looked into it, they realized just how flawed this was. Millions and millions of voters have been taken off the roll because your name or your conditions or your state or your whatever it is doesn't match exactly with what they have. And if you have the same name as 4 other people, good luck. And a lot of people with common names, Jose Jimenez. How many people in Texas have that name? Okay, I'll do it. So let's say you're kicked off the rolls for some reason. This is an ad from the Secretary of State of Ohio. You'd think Ohio would be pretty good. Well, they promote early in-person voting, so you could vote early. That's a really good thing. I have to say, one of the things in-person voting, early in-person voting does is it helps people who can only come on, let's say, the weekends. Let's say they work during the week, or let's say only on Sunday. So one of the things about African Americans that various states tried to suppress was Sunday voting, because there's something called souls to the polls. And the whole church would go to the polls after Sunday church and either vote or register, one or the other. So they promote, so Ohio says, yeah, we do early in-person voting. They even have absentee voting, which is great. And you don't have to have an excuse anymore. However, that little yellow one down at the bottom, let me blow that up a little bit. So of all the people who were kicked off the voting rolls, because the computer said they weren't really legal, or if you didn't vote, some states say if you haven't voted in 2 elections, you get kicked off the rolls. So in Ohio, they said, oh, well, we sent postcards to all the voters to update their addresses. But a lot of people didn't see the postcard. It was one postcard, goes in the trash along with most of the stuff that comes in the mail, and they didn't see it, and so they're off the rolls. So, and they sent it to only people who there was questions about. So, this looks very good until you get into the details. One of the things I would really encourage you to do as students when you decide to take some kind of social action, whatever it is to get deep into the weeds, really study what the details are, because one little thing can make your work so much more effective.
Jim?
Yeah.
Professor Bellissimo, one of our wonderful political science professors, might have an opportunity to put in her 2 cents worth.
Absolutely, let's do it. Let's do it.
Yolanda, I don't know where you're sitting.
Oh, I'm right here.
Great.
Yeah, I was just gonna mention about California,
Great.
that you're talking about all the bad states, and I say something about the state.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think this is a lot of bad states, but I just wanted to let you know that California is actually doing a really good job in this. A lot of states are going backwards in terms of voter registration and voter turnout, and California is going in the other direction. So here's some of the things that they've done in California. You can now register to vote online, so you don't have to be in person or you don't have to fill out a form. Second thing you can do is we have a motor voter law now in California, so that when you register a car or you register to get a driver's license online, you just have to click a button and they'll register you to vote. So the DMV now, you can register to vote through the DMV. It's really easy to do. And then another thing that they're doing is for 16 and 17-year-olds, you can pre-register. As long as you're going to turn 18 by the date of the election, you can register ahead of time, and then they'll send you a ballot. The state's also given all the counties in California permission to do an entirely online vote or mail-in vote, and the state's paying the postage for that. So everybody's entitled to vote by mail, and it's paid postage. So we're doing really well in California. And by the way, in terms of the number of people who have been found to be not voting legally in California, they counted up 23 million people voted in the last 2 elections. So that's combined, 23 million for 2 elections total. And in that, the Secretary of State investigated seriously. There are a lot of people who put in complaints, but the really serious one amounted to 0.001%. So 1/1000th of 1% of people that were really seriously involved in voter fraud.
And also the Citizens Committee decides, we don't gerrymander, the Citizens
Oh,
Committee.
yeah, that's another thing. Yeah, we have an unbiased committee headed by a judge who divides up our state into our 53 congressional districts and our state assembly and state senate districts. Yeah. We're easy.
Thank you for that. Okay, you want to get the lights there? Okay, another game that has been played is closing polling stations. Notice most of them are in the south. In fact, pretty much most of them, all of them. And I want to say again that not everybody in the south feels this way. I don't want to cast anybody at any state or anything. I don't want to make stereotypes out of anybody. But anyway, so when you close a polling place, what does that do? That's what it does. This is Arizona. They closed the majority of polling stations, which forced the average number of people per polling station to be 22,000. And so the wait time was 4 to 6 hours, sometimes more. Florida, other states have the bright red are the longest wait times. It could be hours and hours. So if you have to go to work, what do you do? If you're an elderly person, what do you do? If you can't stand the heat or stand out in the weather, or whatever it is, what do you do?
Oregon and Washington are great because
Yeah.
everybody else is-
Yes, so exactly. See those 2 gray states, Washington and Oregon? They have vote by mail only, right? And the percentage of people who are voting in Oregon and Washington is much higher than the national average because of that. So that would be a beautiful thing to do. Another thing that you probably have heard of is felons in some states cannot vote even though they've done the crime and paid their time. In Florida, on the handout that you all got, it says Florida has this law that of the 1.5 million ex-felons, only few hundred or 1,000 could jump through all the hoops. And so Florida, the citizens had a ballot initiative, whatever they called it in that state, to get rid of the law that prohibited felons, and now 1.5 million ex-felons are entitled to vote. I guarantee you Florida is going to change in the next national election. I can't guarantee it, but it sure looks that way. Okay, and so different states have different levels of what you can do. In California, if you were in prison and you've done parole, that's all you need. Once you're done with that, other states have no restrictions whatsoever. Some have only when you're in prison. So it varies from state to state. Anyway, that's improving. It's completely unfair. You've paid your time. I can't think of anything better than to invite people back into society to participate in an active way and to find a voice, which has been missing when you've been in jail. Sorry if I'm a little cramped up. So this last part is really perhaps the most important one for me. And I call it voter apathy and cynicism and by the way, this was taken last week ago, and last week I did a women's march. Some people are ready to roll. Okay. This was done in July of last year. The poll said only 28% of young voters say they will certainly vote in the midterm. That's why when you raised your hands and you said that most of you who were registered, who could register to vote, voted, it was higher, I bet it was higher than 28%. This is a really good representation. But nationally, that's what they estimated. It turned out that young people, 18 to 29, actually, it turned out to be 31%. But even a few percent make a huge difference. A huge percent make a big difference. And in some states, make all the difference. So who's not voting? Who's not registered, I mean? Well, who's not registered, who's not voting? 18 to 34-year-olds, almost 40%. This is 2 years ago. You could maybe lower that a little bit. But let's say 35% or something of 18 to 34-year-olds are not even registered to vote. Right? Also, African Americans, 30% are not even registered. 42% of Latinos, and unmarried women, about 30%. These are groups that are increasing in population and will have more of a role to play. Oh no. Oh. So I was thinking maybe the best thing to do might be to give everybody a free beer after they voted. This is actually something, this is from England. They actually, some bar actually did this. So how do you get people to vote? How do you, by the way, has anybody seen this anywhere? How many people have seen this? I'm just curious how observant you are. You look at it every day that you go to the cafeteria in your school. I shot this in the displays. Southern Poverty Law Center on campus. I have a question. Is anybody interested in getting together with other students to make sure that your student body is enrolled to vote, to register to vote as much as possible? Is anybody interested in doing that? Okay. Meet up here at the end of the talk, whoever's interested, and figure out how to do it. You're smart guys, but this is one way. Southern Poverty Law Center on campus is one way to facilitate people registering to vote. So if you're interested in helping in some way, just meet up here at the end of the talk. So the 2 steps, you know, are first you register and then you vote. Very simple. Okay, so what would I do? I made this list, I know it has a lot of type, and I try to avoid a lot of type, but, so what would I do? Or what would make it more convenient, more fair, and guarantee more people vote? First of all, get rid of gerrymandering by having neutral redistricting for the states. Streamline voting registration. How about at birth? Why not at birth? You're born, you have a birth certificate, you're registered to vote. Not that you can't, but you know, some states are doing 16 and 17-year-old pre-registration online. California seems like it's very hip, it's really good. Making it more convenient, providing resources. You know, there are some polling stations, the machines don't work and nobody knows how to fix them, that kind of stuff. And one thing I would really do, and it seems like you guys are very clued in, which is wonderful, is to do more civics education, teach how government works, and understand that it's one of the most powerful voices you can have is your vote, any way you can do it legally. My last slide is, I'm asking that you do something. It could be anything, anything. But I'm asking that you be strategic. Learn what you need to do. You know, if it's a state that is a purple state and it wants to go in one direction or the other, find out what state, find out what localities, and go in there and help there. Don't just give money to the Democratic or Republican national committees. It's, in my opinion, sort of a waste of time. Find out, so be granular means get in the fine grain, get down to what's going on locally, and listen before you take action. Find out from the local people what they need. You know, what's happening on the ground in the local. Find out why people are not voting. And then go and help them, educate them, and make them move to vote. Anyway, I hope this has been helpful. Thank you so much.